Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and I'm very happy to be joined again by Paul Rubin, who I think this is part 3. There may be more parts to follow on talking about how government money works and I guess how to make it work for us, which we haven't really been that competent at, maybe not since the FDR days, a long time. So welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you so much to welcome me back, and excited for part 3.
Yeah, well, you know, we just went through a municipal election, and I know that talking about taxpayer money does have relevance on the municipal level, but at some point I feel like we have to change our mindset about how governments allocate their money and what the impact is.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll start out with a review of the basics, which might take a while, and then talk about both how cities and states can maybe do harm reduction with their populations in light of a federal government that clearly doesn't care to spend money for the welfare of the people.
Yep.
And also talk about systemic change that is really needed beyond just the harm reduction we can do.
Sure.
So it's a long list. We'll try. So, I think starting out with the review, I guess the first question is, what's modern monetary theory?
Right. Yeah, so modern monetary theory has been around in the public discourse for maybe 30 years or so now. And it's really built on, it didn't come out of nothing. It came out of a lot of economists in the past, like, century even. Hyman Minsky was one who talked a lot about functional finance, but there in the past, really since like it came onto the scene in around 2000 with Warren Mosler and Randall Wray and some other academics. Stephanie Kelton is famous for popularizing it with a movie that I think we might have talked about last time, Finding the Money, which was released. I think it was released in 2023 or 2024. Award-winning documentary, and so a lot of these concepts have been around for at least a couple of decades, and they've kind of been ridiculed unfairly with straw men kind of arguments about that don't really take into account the actual literature or what we're actually talking about. But especially during COVID, I think it became readily apparent that MMT described what was actually happening, because we had millions and millions of people out of work. We had significantly decreased tax revenue, but the federal government was spending enormously to sustain our economies. Right? So a lot of the concepts about that modern monetary theory posits were confirmed, and then in the aftermath, a lot of that knowledge was kind of lost again, and we went back to this kind of scarcity of money, thinking that the government is financially restrained, the federal government specifically, that it's financially restrained, and it depends on taxpayer dollars that it gets from its citizens and that kind of thing, in order to fund spending projects. And so it's sad because there was a moment for Americans to learn about how the capacity that our government actually has to make people whole, to provide, to grow our economy, to give people what they actually need, fulfill their needs. But in the aftermath of the pandemic, I think a lot of that was kind of lost.
And I hadn't thought about it that way, but at the time of the pandemic, I was thinking of other lessons that we could learn. Like, I've advocated for single payer, universal health care.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe one good thing that comes out of this could be that people would experience that if you needed a COVID test, you might have to wait in line, but you didn't have to decide whether you'd eat lunch or pay for the test.
Yeah.
Or the vaccinations also, whether you had insurance or not, you didn't have to pay out of pocket. And I thought, well, maybe people will see that like this is how a healthcare system can work.
And it's interesting you say that, because I think, in that moment, there was a realization that those kinds of programs benefited us all, right? That if I get COVID, well, then I might end up, passing it on to someone else. Then we are all collectively hurt by it, and therefore we should, protect ourselves. We did an interview. Again, I'm with Real Progressives, and so we have a podcast called Macro and Cheese, where we talk to any number of economists, but also authors. And the last week we had on Emma Holton. The podcast was for Emma Holton. She's a feminist economist, and she really prioritizes. She's from Denmark, and she prioritizes what she calls a care economy, and the idea that our economy is made up of interconnected relationships, and that we're not individual agents. That it's crazy to think of us as kind of these atomized individuals, and that we have to understand that we all benefit from each other's mutual benefit, and there's all this care work that's not valued in terms of our economy, not just healthcare workers, but even just mothers who are not paid. But if you think of your entire life, you think about, well, where did my ability to work in groups or talk, eat, play, there are so many our value structure particularly in uber capitalist economy like the United States is so kind of warped. And so when you're talking about this kind of COVID period, it was an opportunity for people to think, to rethink, to rewire where they're thinking. And I was introduced to MMT during the pandemic when I read The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton, and and a lot of people were opened up to it during that period when we had a lot of downtime and we were doing more reading than other times, and so. But it was an opportunity for us to open our minds, and unfortunately some people did, and I think some people kind of lapsed back into prior conceptions.
So I guess a fundamental principle of it, and it gets more and more complex as you think about how it all ripples, is that the federal government of the U.S. is a currency issuer. Unlike our households, unlike our city, unlike our state, unlike our businesses. So what does that mean in practical terms?
Right, so the federal government has, in large part, unlimited capacity to spend. Its limitations are not taxpayer revenue, they're not what's usually known as the national debt, or interest payments or anything like that. The limitations on the federal government to spend are the real available resources and the productive capacity of the nation to produce whatever is needed, not tax revenue, not borrowing. The federal government doesn't actually. It would kind of silly to think of the currency issuer borrowing from its currency users in a currency only it has the capacity to create into existence. So all money, all currency. I shouldn't say all money, but all positive net money comes from the federal government. If you pull out a dollar bill from your wallet, you think, you might think, oh, I got this from the bank, or my employer gave me this payment or whatever. But if you think about it, every single dollar necessarily comes from the federal government. It doesn't come from private institutions or corporations or from households. If you go back to the first dollar ever spent, you go back to 1787 or whatever, necessarily the spending of dollars must come first, because you can't can't tax dollars that haven't been spent into existence yet. And so, we kind of had in mainstream economics, they kind of had the process backwards. They think, okay, we have to tax or borrow in order to spend more, but it's really the opposite.
Yeah, because the dollars obviously didn't originate with the taxpayers.
Yeah, and you think about we don't dig money out of the ground, right? We don't dig dollars. We don't take a shovel and dig them out of the ground. And it's true even for before we went off the gold standard, we didn't dig bills out of the ground then either. This is another kind of central precept of modern monetary theory. All money is a function of the state, and that goes back to Frederick Knapp, who's turn of the 20th century, I think, who wrote about what he called chartalism, which is kind of as I was talking about, some of the basis for modern monetary theory.
So we talked last time, I think, about the purpose of taxation, because one might think, well, if the government can just create whatever money it needs, right, for whatever purposes it wants to promote, why do we have to tax?
Right. Yeah. So this is specifically at the federal level. So there are really four basic reasons. The first is taxes paid to currency issuers create the demand for the currency in the first place. If you didn't have a tax at all, we think of tax dollars. Think of money or currency as a tax credit. The federal government doesn't need your money in order to spend. It needs us to need its money. So the taxes are there to drive the demand for currency. You need that dollar bill, that U.S. dollar bill, and only that U.S. dollar bill in order to fulfill extinguish your tax obligations. Otherwise, the federal government's going to come after you. It's going to garnish your wages. It's going to seize your property. It's going to throw you in jail. So you need that currency in order to work in the economy. The state wants you to work, wants to create the economy, and so it creates these tax obligations in order to force you to need its unit of account. A second reason that a lot of people commonly think, these others are more kind of mainstream understandable. Another reason is to control wealth and income distribution. So obviously, right now, a lot of the tax laws right now are shooting money upwards. There was actually a study that was looking at in terms of how Trump's tax and spend kind of policies are affecting Connecticut, and it's massively benefiting the top quarter in Connecticut, and the bottom 25% are losing hundreds of millions of dollars en masse. So it's a tool of distribution. Then it's also a tool of control for dissuading or encouraging certain societal behaviors, like the federal government wants more people to invest in green energy, or they want you to stop smoking, or they want there are all sorts of reasons why, social reasons why federal government would impose taxes or provide relief on taxes for things that it wants or that it wants to prevent. And then a final controlling inflation. It's an indirect inflationary control, and it is really important because inflation is one of those kinds of straw men that I was talking about that MMT detractors say, oh, MMT says that you can spend as much as you want and doesn't care about inflation, doesn't even take into account. Actually, my own brother, when I was talking about, it doesn't care about inflation. We're talking about MMT to him, and he's like, well, that's not actually true at all. MMT, maybe more than any other macroeconomic discipline, cares a lot about inflation. And again, inflation is not a consequence of the quantity of money in circulation. It's two primary sources. One is market abuse. So capitalists, monopolies, oligopolies exist to maximize profit and not distribution. And so taxing them and regulating them can control inflation. But also, again, it's going back to resource availability. If the government is spending money and the economy is at full employment, then the private sector is going to be competing with the government over those very, very limited resources. And so you will get inflationary pressure. So that's a final reason for tax.
Yeah, and that's kind of reminiscent to the old visualization of the Great Depression 100 years ago, 100 or almost 100 years ago, that people having wheelbarrows of money to buy bread.
Yeah.
It's because you have like one loaf of bread available for 50 families.
Right. Yeah.
If you can have the economy baking enough bread for everyone, it's not going to be inflationary.
Yep. The people often will refer to Weimar Republic and Venezuela. Venezuela's right, very relevant topic right now. But Zimbabwe, these are kind of strawman examples of this is what happens when you spend too much. But what they're ignoring is the real economy. All of those examples of historical examples. What's being ignored is the actual material conditions that were at play in terms of Weimar, in terms of Germany. It was post World War I. Germany had lost a massive amount of men in the war, and they had a large sector of their manufacturing base. I think it was called the Rhone Valley was seized in the post-war the Versailles Treaty, and they had enormous amounts of debt that was denominated in a currency not their own. It was denominated in French francs. And that's something to recognize that's important. Our government can afford any debts that are denominated in its own currency. But other nations on which we use debt servitude and entrapment schemes on are necessarily have to obtain US dollars if those schemes are denominated in US dollars. They have to obtain US dollars in order to get out of those debts. And so they'll open up their markets, they'll privatize the resources like we often do the global south. So
yeah. And it's a topic for another day, but I do wonder what happened in Europe when they went over to the euro and so many nations that had their own sovereign currency now don't.
It's a huge topic for MMT. Maybe we can save it for another time, but it is really, it's a topic that a lot of MMT folks have spent a lot of time on because it's,
Well, I do think that one of the things that interests me with MMT is the reality is kind of easy to see. It's obvious, or I think it should be obvious anyway. But the way it impacts everything else gets so complicated.
Sure. Yeah.
So yes, now you brought up, well, before we go to that, because you were talking about real resources, I know that the MMT, people are in favor not so much of universal basic income, but of a jobs guarantee, and I wonder if you might want to touch on that.
Yeah, we definitely can. I mean, it's the one. MMT is really a descriptive framework, a lens to analyze our economy, how federal finance operations work and stuff like this, and it's not so much prescriptive. It's not that you do MMT. It's a lens to analyze our economy. Job guarantee is probably the only real prescriptive element, a policy that's put forward, and it's used as an inflationary control. It's used certainly. I mean, in terms of comparing it to the universal basic income, the UBI would just give everyone $1,000 a month and say, go out and purchase your health care on the open market, feed your families, do whatever we want with it. A federal job guarantee would be federally financed. So the federal government has unlimited fiscal capacity to make things happen. But it would be locally administered. So New London says, okay, we got these, whatever. It doesn't have to be, just pothole filling. It could be we don't have enough teachers, or we don't have enough, whatever it may be, or it could be it's definable by however that local community would see its local needs being met, and it goes back to. Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, he was actually advocating for both. But the difference between UBI, one of the main differences between UBI and federal job guarantee is a UBI doesn't increase productive capacity at all. It just gives you a bunch of cash and tells you to go out. The federal job guarantee actually does massively increase productive capacity, and it would fluctuate with the business cycle. So if the private, it would offer a competition to the private market, and so it would benefit both people who are involuntarily unemployed, who are looking for work but don't have it, but it would also positively impact the people who are already in the private workforce, because it would provide competition not just in pay, but benefits and all the rest. So.
And when we were talking about COVID, we were talking about how a lot of the service economy is sort of either volunteer or very low pay. I worked in early childhood ed, and it's terribly low paid for an essential service.
As I was mentioning, going back to Emma Holton, it is unbelievably undervalued. It really, and we have a profit-driven kind of mindset here in the United, completely profit-driven mindset, and it's to our detriment, right? I think people can see as they're struggling to make ends, not just make ends meet, but have a quality of life that's desirable. I think it's apparent, but so many of these things are just taken as givens. That, well, this is how it is. I wish we could do something, but federal government doesn't. I can't. Where's the money going to come from? That is the most common refrain from both Republicans and Democrats within an election cycle. How are you going to pay for it?
So you mentioned tool for distribution.
Yep.
And so right now our federal government, well, it's very chaotic, but it's also got a mindset of austerity.
Yep.
So many public programs have been, funding is stopped for them.
Yeah.
And I saw, it wasn't funding being stopped exactly, but Head Start, where I worked for a long time, was reclassified, and it makes it more vulnerable to shut down. I don't know. So we have austerity at the federal level, and I guess I want to talk about that because it's a choice. It isn't that there isn't money.
Yep.
So
that is something so important to realize. I mean, all these are political choices, particularly at the federal level. You can think about, in some ways, there's a hierarchy of monetary sovereignty, where the federal government has, virtually, except for we're talking about real resource availability and that kind of stuff, virtually unlimited capacity. And then at the state level, they have way significantly less capacity, but they have more than at the local level, more than at the municipal level. And so for the federal government, these are all policy choices. Homelessness is a policy choice. Extreme poverty is a policy choice. Joblessness, unemployment is a policy choice. And there are reasons why these policy choices are taken, and it's something we can hopefully get into a little bit later. But I think it's primarily because our governments, I think it's even more stark at the federal level, but our governments don't operate for working class interests. They operate for corporate interests, for financier interests, and for a different class of society that's not represented.
And that includes like kids, young people, not just people who are in a certain demographic necessarily. During New London's last municipal election, the school board budget was a huge bone of contention because they were flat funded, which in effect is a loss of revenue because there were contractual obligations that had been approved but were not funded. There were health insurance cost rises and some other, costs that went up, and they were not funded to just provide the same services at whatever they cost now.
Right.
They just had to cut. And one thing that really struck me is special education is very unpredictable in a school budget. That was like the one thing that really shocked me when I was on Board of Ed. One student could move into a district, and if it was a high needs student, it could be a six-figure line item on the budget just for that. However, all of our special education services are administered according to federal law. They are federal mandates. So why are the local school boards footing some of the bill and the state footing some of the bill and not the federal government? It's their mandate.
It is really crazy. And I think it goes back to what we're saying about class interests. And it's a way of disciplining the working class into accepting lower quality of life, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any kind of like rational sense if you want to try to build a society that's healthy and well functioning and stuff. It doesn't make any sense at all. But the unfunded mandates, where unfunded federal mandates, and at the state level too. And a lot of the unfunded federal mandate kind of stuff. It's not like they're bad ideas or bad laws. You think of like the American Disabilities Act, or you think of Medicare. I think it's Medicare.
Well, both. There's Medicare and Medicaid.
Husky is none of these, or you think about climate initiatives. Like most of these things are not. Either they're entirely not federally funded, or there is a certain amount of it that necessarily must come from state and local financing, and the state then ends up passing a lot of the funding mechanisms off to the local communities, and which is really disastrous because it ends up becoming like a kind of like a spiraling down, where if your community is particularly needy, like New London is, where it's a kind of a central hub, and there are a lot of language requirements. Right. I think that was one of the things I was reading in terms of like Ned Lamont was talking about. It's so important that people, that our children have the capacity to learn in different languages and that kind of stuff. Well, who's gonna fund it? You end up passing it off to local communities who are wholly dependent on usually it's property taxes in order to fund these things. Well, if you have a depressed tax base where you have these poor populations, they're not going to be able to come up with the money for it.
And the state doesn't even fund the payment in lieu of taxes that by statute they're supposed to. They fund it somewhat, right, but not the percentage of loss that the right, urban hubs have to take. So yeah, it's I feel too that part of the purpose of government for me at any level is there are some things that you spread risk around by doing things collectively.
Yeah.
And so all these schemes sort of externalize the risk to those entities that can least afford to take them.
Yep.
We see it in health insurance, the capitated payment systems that basically the insurance company pays a physician, a healthcare provider, a set amount for a patient, and if the patient is high needs, the doctor has to take the risk.
Right.
It's not a pooled risk system anymore, and
yep,
I feel as though government, in a broader way than insurance, is, meant to do the things that if we pool our resources and our risk together,
yeah,
they go better.
Yep.
I did spend one summer living in like the woods of Oregon without running water or electricity.
Right.
We lasted about 2 months.
Yep.
And it's like I kind of like paying my property tax in return for all that stuff,
right,
because I know what an effort it is to provide it just as a family.
Just as yourself, it's very difficult, right? Like as atomized individuals, we don't last very long.
No, we don't. So when we were going back and forth texting, you would share the quote, "Austerity is murder."
Yeah, it is. I mean, you think about I think throughout the United States, there's something like, I remember this during the Bernie campaigns, I think I was studied by Harvard, or something like 45,000 Americans die every year because they don't have access to sufficient health care. And that's crazy. That's insane. But we do it because our government operates not for constituent interests, not for working class interests, but the insurance companies and the for-profit healthcare system, and so it's they own our Congress. They own not just Congress, but the institutions throughout our federal government. So. I think that's why it happens, and it's true. I mean, we've seen it now in the last year where we have these rising homelessness. I think it's something. It was like it's something a 10% rise in homelessness in Connecticut. We have I think something like 10% of Connecticut citizens aren't insured. It's something like a quarter of all Connecticut residents are underinsured. We have something like 74,000 unemployed. I mean, and you think about all that, lost productivity, and you can think of just in terms of like, just basic GDP terms, but you can also just think of it in terms of like, what are those actual impacts on these people's lives? It's disastrous.
And many of them do have skills. and
Sure.
they're not getting paid for using them.
And that is one of the things about the job guarantee that I didn't mention. It's like it's very difficult for a business to want to hire. I mean, the last person they look for is someone who's unemployed.
Right.
So what job guarantee does is it provides training, it provides employment, and it provides the ability for those people to go into the private sector afterwards with some kind of like prior, not just prior training, but employment record.
So even I was talking to one person who worked for a group that advocates for the homeless, who was saying that there are new demographics that are experiencing homelessness for the first time, including a lot of older people.
Yeah.
So even with Social Security, rents are crazy. We have a friend who ended up moving out of New London because a new landlord company bought the apartment building, and rents were going up $500 a month at the end of the year. That's a big shift.
It's crazy. I mean, we have a society that prioritizes profit. Not we think of like exchange value in terms of like, okay, what can this be sold for? In terms of like, what can this house how many people can fit can be housed by this certain arrangement? Like how many people can be taken off the street and provided better quality of life. It's
So our governor in Connecticut has had kind of an austerity mindset as well. I keep hearing about the fiscal guardrails, although I see that since he announced that he's running for re-election, has not been quite as austere. But you had brought up, when we were going back and forth on it, what can our state and our cities do to reduce the harm of what's coming?
So it sounds like Lamont is. I mean, like they've prioritized, or the state legislature has come up with like this $500 million emergency relief fund to kind of fill some of the backstops. But an article that we did an interview with folks from Money on the Left. They come up with this kind of alternative funding proposal that would really only work temporarily this was released. The article I think was released sometime in like the spring of 2025, as I remember, and so it was really as Trump was pushing a lot of these these illegal cuts, where from DOGE and kind of line item veto stuff, which is supposed to be illegal. I guess it was actually Nixon who tried it, and there was a law that was passed that was supposed to make. I mean, Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse, not the president. The president can't just go. This is we don't want this. We don't want this. We want this. And so while I think there have been something like. Since the beginning of 2025, I was looking at there's a tracker for Connecticut. Connecticut has sued Trump just on financial grounds, something like 20 times on funding mechanism stuff. And so some of it has been reversed, but a lot of that article and the interview that we did was before. Congress passed a budget. I think it was like 51-50, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars in budgetary cuts from the federal government. Everything from homelessness and food assistance program, SNAP programs to Department of Education cuts, and there were massive amounts of firings, healthcare, HHS cuts. And all this is going to be, had significant effects on Connecticut residents we're already struggling with the affordability crisis, but now it's going to get even worse. So the Money on the Left's proposal was basically a giant bond drive. Thinking in terms of how much is raised in terms of in terms of political campaigns and that kind of stuff, hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, think about if we used all that money, and instead of like your taxes going to pay for something again, this is at the state and local level, they would selling of the bonds, and anyone can our states and municipalities sell bonds right now. It's just that they're used for some type of commercial infrastructure that would benefit some corporation in their district or something like that. Well, their idea was that you sell bonds, and you incentivize them by providing a solid rate of interest back, and so you'd be making an investment in your local community, be making an investment against austerity, you'd be making an investment to improve not just quality of life of your residents, but maybe business infrastructure and the ability for, we think about a lot of the capital flight that happens. It's not just, a lot of it is because we don't have the infrastructure to support the businesses that we'd want to attract. And so there's this fight when we can get to that later, but in terms of capital flight. But
yeah, and we will talk about capital flight. Although I think. Well, we'll get to that. So on the blue bonds, I'm thinking that the Democratic Party could kind of get some good PR off. I mean, not that, I care that much about their good PR, but it would be good for them to get credit for doing something that, was sort of uplifting and was reducing people's suffering. Yeah,
it's funny. I think that I often think of this kind of ratchet effect with party politics and more broadly. A lot of this is kind of like the fake politics of internal red-blue politics. But the ratchet effect is commonly referred to as like the right wing cranks everything to the right, and then the Democrats or liberal will do just enough to maintain that position. They'll come up with all sorts of excuses, what we call the rotating villain. That darn parliamentarian, or
we don't have the money for it.
We don't have the money for that is a primary. We have to make sure that we're balancing the budget or all of this kind of stuff. It's a real problem, and they would have a win on their hands. But I think that they're not interested. They often think of the Washington Generals and filling the Democrats filling the role of the Washington Generals and the Harlem Globetrotters of why can't we just and a lot of I could call them normies, but a lot of folks would say, if the Democrats just did this, and my response is, well, they're operating as they're supposed to, right?
And we've seen this for a long time. I think FDR had a lot of pressure on him and was in a very unusual position. But nowadays, especially since Bill Clinton's administration, we have not seen a lot of progress during the Democratic administrations. They haven't been as overtly cruel,
right?
But we haven't really seen. I mean, everyone's talking about how the Affordable Care Act was the answer to our health care issues, and it really fell very far short.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the promises that Biden made, or public option, was like that was the compromise position, right? And that fell by the wayside almost immediately on day one. That was never, it hasn't been brought up, ever again, and it's really unfortunate. But I thought of the Medicare for all being a compromise of a compromise.
Right.
That I would rather have a universal health program that was, a national health care system that's fully funded by the federal government, and instead of,
Well, we have so many models for different kinds of healthcare funding.
Sure.
Because the VA and Indian, Native American health services are federal programs.
Yep.
But Medicaid is one thing and Medicare is something else, and increasingly privatized all the time.
Yep.
Connecticut's sort of gaming that system. State retirees were all switched over to Advantage plans.
Yep.
because for the state of Connecticut, because the reimbursement rates are higher for the Advantage plans, it could be a moneymaker for the state or a money saver for the state.
It's crazy.
So so what would, just in a few words, what would it look like to have blue bonds on the market?
Yeah, so I think it would just be just like we have right now, states selling bonds, and they're using them for whatever backfilling whatever austerity measures are being pushed by the federal government. Well, I think what's important to remember though is there is this hierarchy of monetary sovereignty, and states this would temporarily offer some kind of relief, maybe. But the concern is that the states aren't currency issuers. They're not. They can't. They don't have the capacity of the federal government to net spend money into existence. And so the danger is that ultimately you'll be relying on tax revenue to whether at some point. I mean, it might be okay for the next couple of years or something like that, but eventually you're going to have to either get federal funding or you're going to have to raise taxes locally or by the state, and that leads to the concerns about capital flight, which are real. I mean, that we have this kind of spiraling of where our states and municipalities are competing against each other for business. And you're never going to beat out Texas in terms of their tax rates, or what it's going to be, or Florida. What would be preferable for a corporation to move down there? And so that is a real, and it works the same way in terms of local communities as well, where if you have a business that's local. Right. They might move to another locality where they're not.
We might be seeing, EB moving from New London to Waterford.
I mean, I'm sure that they would, they're going to, and those in power are going to be threatening that all the time, right?
So let's talk about systemic stuff, because we're kind of running out of time.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of slides. One that kind of illustrates where our policy makers get their input, that they listen to.
Yeah, right.
That U.S. is an oligarchy. It really is
right.
not a democracy.
Right.
So let's talk about the system and how going from, the subject of capital flight to the huge influence that capital has on the decisions that are being made, and what can we do about it?
The graph that's up on I think we shared this last time, but there's a graph from, I think it was 2014, of a study of about 2 decades of policy data that compared support among constituencies to the legislative likelihood of those laws getting passed. And the difference between elite representation, which kind of tracks pretty well, and the bottom 90%, which is basically like a flat line of like zero, when really the main quote is, the preferences of average Americans appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. So if we were a democracy, if we had any agency, and I think we've seen this in terms of like the policies that happen all the time. I mean, our government is pursuing policies that are very unpopular, whether it's genocide or it's endless war, whatever it is, or unfunded mandates, or the austerity proposals that they push, and so I think that does go to, I think a lot of the stuff that we talk about in terms of MNT is relatively is known. I mean, I think that the policymakers understand a lot of the stuff that the MMT is talking about, but it's not in their interest to provide. It's not in their. They will spend $6 trillion on war in Afghanistan and Iraq without raising taxes. I talk about this to people all the time. If you think that our military funding is funded by increased taxes, which tax increases did George W. Bush and Barack Obama raise? Where the legislature?
Wait, so they
Congress,
really know?
They know. They have to know. They have to know because they're the ones who are writing the bills to spend.
So we have a couple quick slides about the limitations of trying to vote our way out of this. One of which is a quote from Lenin, who kind of was talking about the same thing Marx was, that really when we're voting, we're voting in.
We're choosing.
We're choosing our ruling class.
Yeah, we're
members.
choosing between, and I think it's a common refrain that we people recognize today. They're like kind of two halves of the duopoly. And a lot of the choice is to determine to help facilitate the illusion of choice. It's something George Carlin talked about all the time. There is really no choice in terms of our politics. It's just kind of an illusion. So to decide once every few years whether members of the ruling class repress and crush the people through parliament. Marx, I think, talked about as the choice between two ruling parties is not much of a choice at all.
And the next slide, the interesting thing to me about it basically says the same thing: the limitations of voting and what workers need to do. Is this cartoon is from 1916?
1916. I hear this
so this has been going on for a long time. And just kind of gets us thinking about our last 5 minutes, which is all we got, is how can we, of the working class, wield the power we have? What does our power look like, and how can we do something about it?
I think the first step, and some people this will sound fatalistic or conciliatory or something like that, is to recognize that we don't live in a democracy. I think there is marginal value in voting at the local levels in terms where you
harm reduction.
There is some argument for harm reduction certainly at the municipal level and stuff like that, where you can have more impact maybe, but certainly at the federal level you just have no agency whatsoever. And so all of the money, all the time, all the attention that's spent. Hundreds of millions of dollars, I was
Who knows better than you?
I was a huge Bernie supporter. I canvassed, I donated, but there's something like I forget whether it's $300 million or something like that was raised between his two campaigns. If you think about all the time and attention that was spent on Bernie, for, well-intentioned folks, and were spent on mutual aid, on building union power and this kind of stuff. And so that cartoon was from 1916, and I think we have been, in a sense, lobotomized from how real change is forced, how class struggle forces history along, and. That it's, the labor rights weren't won in the voting booth, which was I think something that the cartoon was speaking to. Yes. Women's suffrage wasn't won in the voting booth. Civil rights, New Deal reforms weren't won voting booth. I mean, that was something that you referred to earlier, that FDR had to be pushed by two socialist parties and a communist party to concede these kind of minimal demands. And so. It's just I think the first step is recognizing that kind of reality.
And then I feel as though since we're the working class, withholding work strikes might be one of the best ways to leverage.
I think it's got to be. It's got to be. But the decline in union power has been rapid since the 1970s, and now now with business unionism, kind of they're playing into corporate hands.
And we have one last slide with resources, and like about 1 minute left. You can also like attend these the podcast
Yes.
meetings.
Yeah, this is some of our information. We have a Substack, realprogressives.org. You can go to our website. We have a Substack. Search for, on all podcast platforms, just search for Macro and Cheese. We come out with the weekly episodes where we discuss all these topics for a wide variety of subjects. You can find our Facebook page, a group, and we're on X as well, Real Progress US.
And I can attest to the fact that the podcast kind of run the gamut of topics because it touches pretty much everything.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Paul. We didn't get to everything,
Nope,
of
that's
course,
fine.
but there can be a part 4.
Fantastic.
The last time you were on was last May, over 6 months ago. So,
Maybe sooner, hopefully.
hopefully
Okay.
it won't take another 6 or 7 months. So thank you so much. And for all of you out there, it's worth learning more about it because, knowing what the world we live in is about is maybe the first step we have to take to doing something
I
about
think
it.
so.
So thank you, Paul, and
Thank
we'll
you,
see you
Rana.
all next week.
When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. When the rain don't fall, that's when you know you're gonna go dry. And it won't do no good to be crying out loud, babe, or cursing the sky.